She knocked on the wheelchair-bound veteran's door with homemade soup, same as every Thursday for 6 months. But when his son answered, pale, elegant, with eyes like winter nights, she realized the frail man she'd been caring for was father to the vampire king. Now both men stared at her with identical hunger, and she wasn't sure if it was for her soup or her blood. Emma's hands shake as she sets the ceramic container on the scratched wooden table, the same table where she has shared countless Thursday afternoons listening to Thomas recount stories from a war that suddenly carries new meaning. The temperature in the small kitchen drops another degree as Adrian moves behind her, his presence radiating a cold that has nothing to do with winter and everything to do with something fundamentally other than human. Thomas wheels himself closer, his weathered fingers gripping the armrests of his chair with surprising strength, and Emma notices for the first time how his knuckles bear scars that look like bite marks, healed over decades but still visible in the afternoon light filtering through yellowed curtains. Adrian speaks in a voice like silk over steel, each word measured and precise, as he explains that her discovery has triggered ancient protocols that have governed vampire society since before the fall of Rome. The laws are absolute, carved in blood and enforced by entities older than nations, designed to protect both species from the chaos that would follow if mortals learned the truth about what walks among them in the darkness. Emma sinks into the familiar chair where she has sat every Thursday for half a year, her mind struggling to reconcile the gentle invalid who thanked her for soup and shared photos of his late wife with the reality that his son rules over creatures of legend and nightmare. Thomas reaches across the table to touch her wrist, his skin papery but warm, human in a way that suddenly feels precious and fragile, and he tells her that the stories he shared about Vietnam were true but incomplete, that the night missions he described involved more than enemy soldiers, that the government had known about vampires and werewolves and things without names since World War II and had learned to use them as weapons. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Adrian's movements remain fluid and controlled as he explains that Thomas served in a classified unit called Project Nightfall, mortals who worked alongside supernatural entities to gather intelligence and eliminate threats that conventional forces could not touch. The old soldier had been wounded not by shrapnel, but by a creature that fed on fear itself, and his survival had earned him a place in vampire memory, a protection that extended to his care in old age, but could not shield those who discovered their secret by accident. Emma feels the walls of her ordinary life crumbling around her as Adrian describes the supernatural ecosystem that exists parallel to human society. Vampires who serve as nobility and enforcers, werewolves who patrol borders between territories, witches who maintain the barriers that keep ancient horrors from bleeding through into mortal reality. The apartment she thought she knew reveals itself as something else entirely, every shadow deeper than it should be, every mirror reflecting angles that hurt to contemplate, every photograph on the mantel hiding figures that move when she is not looking directly at them. Thomas explains that Adrian chose this place because its history soaks the walls with enough death and sorrow to fuel protective wards, that the building itself exists partially outside normal space, that the other tenants she sometimes glimpsed in the hallway were not entirely human and not entirely real. Adrian's voice carries the weight of centuries as he describes how vampire law evolved from necessity rather than cruelty, how exposure to human society without proper safeguards had led to witch hunts and inquisitions, to wars that decimated both species until treaties were written in blood and bound by magic that could not be broken without cosmic consequences. Emma realizes that her weekly visits were never as innocent as they seemed, that her genuine care for Thomas had been monitored by watchers she never saw, evaluated by courts she could not imagine, judged by standards that predated written history. The soup grows cold as Adrian explains that her choice to continue visiting even when Thomas seemed confused or difficult Her decision to bring medicine when he was sick and books when he was lonely, her simple human kindness had created a bond that supernatural law recognizes as significant and dangerous. Thomas grips her hand tighter as his son reveals that vampire society is built on hierarchies of power and blood, that Adrian's position as king of the Northeastern Territories comes with responsibilities to protect both his subjects and the human population under his domain, that her presence in their lives has created a liability that his enemies will exploit without mercy. The kitchen fills with tension thick as smoke, as Adrian describes the enemies who watch his territory for signs of weakness, vampires who believe that compassion is corruption and that humans exist only to serve or to feed their betters. Emma learns that her Thursday visits have been reported to courts in Europe and Asia, that ancient vampires with names lost to human history are already moving to exploit what they see as Adrian's fatal attachment to mortal concerns. Thomas wheels his chair closer to Emma and reveals that his journals from Vietnam contain information that could either protect or destroy the supernatural community, detailed accounts of government cooperation and cover-ups, names and locations of entities that most humans think are myths. The weight of discovery settles on Emma's shoulders like a burial shroud, as she understands that her simple desire to help a lonely old man has pulled her into conflicts that span centuries and threaten to reshape the balance between worlds. Adrian's winter eyes reflect depths of sorrow as he explains that supernatural law offers her three choices, each carrying consequences that will define the rest of her existence, whether it lasts days or decades. She can accept the gift of vampire transformation, trading her humanity for immortality and power, but losing forever the compassion that made her valuable to them in the first place. She can submit to binding as a thrall, retaining her human form, but surrendering her free will to become Adrian's property, protected but enslaved, safe but no longer truly herself. The third option carries the greatest risk and the greatest potential reward. An ancient ritual that could make her a bloodkeeper, a human granted the right to know vampire secrets and care for vampire families in exchange for absolute loyalty and silence. Thomas explains that bloodkeepers were common in medieval times, mortals who served vampire courts as healers and advisors. But the practice died out centuries ago, when too many were corrupted by proximity to power, or drove mad by knowledge they were not meant to possess. The ritual to create a bloodkeeper requires drinking blessed blood mixed with herbs that grow only in graveyards, a mixture that will either bond her to Adrian's bloodline or poison her if her motives contain any selfishness or deception. Emma stares at the cold soup, remembering 6 months of Thursday afternoons, Thomas's gratitude when she helped him shower, his tears when she brought flowers on the anniversary of his wife's death, the way his face lit up when she walked through the door each week. She thinks about the other patients she sees at the hospital, the elderly and disabled who have no visitors, no one to bring them soup or listen to their stories, no one to remind them that they matter in a world that often treats them as burdens rather than treasures. Adrian's voice softens as he tells her that the choice must be made quickly, that his enemies are already moving to exploit her discovery, that every moment she remains unbound by supernatural law puts all three of them in greater danger. The afternoon sun slants through the window, casting long shadows that seem to move independently of their sources. And Emma realizes that this kitchen, this table, this man in his wheelchair and his impossible son have become the center of her universe in ways she never imagined. Thomas squeezes her hand one more time and tells her that whatever she chooses, she has already given him the greatest gift possible, 6 months of feeling human again after years of isolation, 6 months of remembering what kindness looks like when it expects nothing in return. The clock on the wall ticks toward evening, toward the time when vampires grow stronger and choices become irrevocable, and Emma understands that her next words will determine not only her own fate, but the future of an alliance between species that could change both their worlds forever. The air in Thomas's apartment shifts without warning, growing thick and electric as reality bends around the arrival of beings older than memory. Emma feels the temperature plummet as shadows coalesce into forms that hurt to look at directly. Three figures materializing from darkness with the authority of judges who have presided over life and death for millennia. Cordelia appears first, her Renaissance gown pristine despite centuries of wear, her face beautiful in the way that marble sculptures are beautiful, cold and perfect and utterly inhuman. Her eyes holding the accumulated frost of 500 winters. Marcus follows, his Roman armor gleaming with an inner light that speaks of battles fought when the world was young, his bearing that of a soldier who conquered empires and watched them crumble to dust, his presence filling the small kitchen with the weight of absolute authority. Vera emerges last, her plague doctor's mask and robes shifting between historical periods as if she cannot decide which century she belongs to, her movements precise and clinical as she surveys the apartment with the detached interest of a scientist examining specimens. Emma's hand tightens on Thomas's as the council members circle the kitchen table like predators evaluating prey, their attention focused on her with an intensity that makes her skin crawl and her heart race with primitive fear. Cordelia speaks first, her voice carrying the refined cruelty of aristocrats who never doubted their right to decide who lives and dies, explaining that surveillance wards woven into the fabric of reality itself monitor every interaction between supernatural entities and mortals, that Emma's repeated visits triggered automatic alerts that brought her to their attention months ago. The revelation hits Emma like ice water as she realizes that every Thursday afternoon, every shared meal and conversation, every moment of genuine connection with Thomas has been observed and catalogued by beings who view human emotion as either weakness or threat. Marcus steps forward, his presence radiating the disciplined violence of a career soldier, and explains that vampire law exists not from malice, but from necessity. That exposure to human society without proper safeguards has historically led to witch hunts and inquisitions that claimed thousands of lives on both sides. His voice carries the weight of someone who has personally witnessed the consequences of discovered secrets, who has stood over battlefields where humans and vampires died in equal measure because trust was betrayed and fear became genocide. Vera approaches Emma with the clinical detachment of a medieval physician, her masked face tilting as she examines the human woman like a particularly interesting disease specimen, noting aloud the signs of genuine emotional attachment, the absence of typical fear responses that mark humans who seek vampire contact for selfish reasons. The council discusses Emma's fate as if she were not present, weighing evidence with the dispassionate efficiency of judges who have presided over countless similar cases throughout history. Thomas grips Emma's hand with desperate strength as Cordelia outlines the traditional response to unauthorized discovery: immediate execution to prevent exposure, carried out so cleanly that Emma would simply vanish from mortal records without a trace. Marcus presents the alternative of thrall binding, a magical enslavement that would preserve Emma's life while ensuring her absolute loyalty and silence, transforming her into Adrian's property in all but name. The discussion grows heated as Vera proposes a third option that clearly disturbs her colleagues, suggesting that Emma's demonstrated compassion and genuine care for Thomas might qualify her for consideration as a bloodkeeper, an ancient role that has not been filled in over 2 centuries. Cordelia's beautiful face twists with distaste as she explains that bloodkeepers were mortals granted extraordinary privileges to serve vampire courts as healers and advisors, but that the practice was abandoned when too many proved unworthy of the trust placed in them. Marcus adds that the last attempt to create a bloodkeeper resulted in betrayal that cost hundreds of vampire lives, a human who used their privileged position to lead witch hunters directly to vampire sanctuaries. Vera insists that Emma represents a unique opportunity to revive a beneficial tradition, pointing to her nursing background, her demonstrated compassion, and her emotional bond with Thomas as evidence of her suitability. The debate continues as shadows lengthen and evening approaches, bringing with it the time when vampire power grows strongest and decisions become irrevocable. Emma listens to her fate being decided by beings who existed before her country was founded, who view her entire life as less significant than a single day in their endless existence, who speak of her death or enslavement with the casual indifference of immortals discussing the weather. Thomas finally speaks, his voice cracked but firm, as he tells the council about Emma's weekly visits, her patience with his war stories and confused episodes, her kindness in bringing medicine when he was sick and flowers when he was lonely. His words paint a picture of simple human decency that seems to surprise the ancient vampires, who have grown accustomed to mortal behavior motivated by fear or greed rather than genuine compassion. Vera nods slowly as Thomas describes how Emma never asked for anything in return, never showed curiosity about Adrian's nocturnal schedule or unusual habits, never attempted to profit from her knowledge of their unusual circumstances. The council retreats to confer in a language that predates written history, their voices creating harmonics that make Emma's bones ache and her vision blur. When they return, Vera announces their decision with the finality of a death sentence, that Emma will undergo the ritual of blood binding to test her worthiness as a bloodkeeper, a trial that will either grant her unprecedented privileges or kill her in the most agonizing way possible. Thomas's face drains of color as he realizes what they intend, his hands shaking as he tells Emma about witnessing bloodkeeper rituals during his service in Vietnam. How the blessed blood mixture could transform worthy candidates but acted as deadly poison to those with impure motives. Adrian's composure finally cracks as he protests the council's decision, arguing that the ritual is too dangerous and that Emma should not be forced to risk her life for a crime she committed in innocence. Cordelia silences him with a look that could freeze fire, reminding him that his position as territorial king does not grant him authority over council judgments, that his obvious attachment to the mortal actually strengthens their case for immediate action. The basement of the building transforms as the council prepares the ritual space, walls shifting to reveal chambers carved from black stone that exist between dimensions, lit by cold fire that burns without heat or smoke. Emma descends stone steps that seem to extend infinitely downward, each footfall echoing in spaces that stretch beyond the building's physical foundations. The ritual chamber itself defies geometry, circular walls covered in symbols that shift and writhe when observed directly, a ceiling that opens onto star patterns that belong to no earthly sky. In the center stands an altar carved from a single piece of obsidian, its surface reflecting depths that seem to contain entire universes, surrounded by implements that gleam with their own inner light. Vera prepares the binding mixture with ritualistic precision, combining Adrian's freely given blood with water, blessed by entities older than Christianity, herbs that have grown in graveyards, where saints and sinners lie buried together. The mixture glows with sickly phosphorescence as she stirs it with a rod carved from the bone of a creature that died before humans learned to speak. Emma watches the preparation with growing dread and determination, understanding that this moment represents not just her own survival, but the future of any relationship between vampires and humans based on trust rather than domination. Thomas wheels himself to the edge of the ritual circle, his face etched with guilt and sorrow as he begs Adrian to find another way, to use his authority to protect Emma from consequences she never deserved. Adrian's response carries centuries of frustrated helplessness, as he explains that council law supersedes territorial authority, that his power to protect those under his domain extends only as far as supernatural politics allow. The goblet containing Emma's fate gleams in the cold fire as Vera explains the ritual's mechanics, how the blessed blood will react to Emma's deepest motivations and judge her worthy or wanting. If her care for Thomas springs from genuine compassion without hidden agenda, the mixture will bond her to Adrian's bloodline and grant her protection under vampire law. If she harbors selfish desires for power, immortality, or forbidden knowledge, the blood will poison her from within, causing death so agonizing that even vampires who have witnessed centuries of violence turn away in horror. Emma takes the goblet with steady hands, despite the terror coursing through her veins, feeling the weight of destiny and the eyes of immortal judges upon her. She thinks about Thomas's gratitude when she helped him bathe, his tears when she brought flowers for his late wife's photograph, the simple human dignity he maintained despite his limitations and losses. As she raises the goblet to her lips, she sees genuine fear in Adrian's ancient eyes and realizes that his concern is not for the political consequences of her death, but for the loss of someone who has become precious to him in ways that transcend supernatural law or vampire politics. The blessed blood strikes Emma's tongue like liquid fire and ice combined, burning down her throat with a cold flame that spreads through her veins like starlight given substance and purpose. Her vision explodes into kaleidoscope fragments as the blood bond takes hold, pulling her consciousness through corridors of memory that belong to someone else entirely. Centuries of existence compressed into heartbeats that feel like eternities. She sees through Adrian's eyes as plague ravages medieval London, his mortal form dying in a charity hospital, while something ancient and terrible offers him a choice between death and damnation. The transformation burns through her awareness like acid, showing her the agony of becoming something inhuman, the first terrible hunger, and the horror of realizing what he must do to survive. She experiences his early years as a vampire, the brutal education in supernatural politics, the way he learned to navigate courts where weakness meant death and compassion was considered mental illness. Through the blood bond, she witnesses his gradual evolution from predator to protector, decisions made over decades that slowly transformed him from a creature who fed on humans to one who defended them against threats they could never imagine. She feels his exhaustion from centuries of maintaining balance between worlds, the weight of responsibility for territory spanning multiple states and millions of lives, both human and supernatural. The visions shift to more recent memories: Adrian's anguish when Thomas was paralyzed, his desperate attempts to heal his father using vampire magic that can mend supernatural wounds but proves useless against purely human injuries. She experiences his guilt and helplessness, the terrible irony of possessing immortal power that cannot save the one mortal who matters most to him. The blood bond crystallizes with a sensation like lightning striking directly into her soul, creating connections between their minds that pulse with shared emotion and understanding. Emma gasps as the ritual chamber comes back into focus, her awareness expanded beyond normal human perception to encompass layers of reality she never knew existed. She can sense Adrian's relief and wonder as the bond settles into place, feel his emotions as clearly as her own, understand the depth of his concern for both her survival and Thomas's welfare. The council watches with expressions ranging from amazement to concern as the bond proves stronger than any they have witnessed in centuries, pulsing with connections that transcend the usual master-servant dynamic to create something resembling partnership between species. Vera removes her plague mask for the first time, revealing a face marked by centuries of witnessing both healing and horror, her expression thoughtful as she examines the magical resonance still crackling through the ritual chamber. She declares the binding successful, but warns that its unusual strength makes Emma valuable and dangerous in equal measure, a human who can serve as bridge between worlds, but who also represents a potential weakness that enemies will exploit without mercy. Cordelia and Marcus exchange glances that speak volumes about political implications, their ancient minds already calculating how Adrian's bond with a mortal might be used against him by rivals who view compassion as corruption. The return to the apartment feels like emerging from underwater. Emma's enhanced senses overwhelming her with information about the supernatural landscape that surrounds their building. She can feel protective wards humming in the walls, sense watchers in shadows that normal eyes could never detect, perceive the complex network of alliances and threats that define Adrian's territory. Thomas waits in his wheelchair with tears streaming down his weathered face, relief and guilt warring in his expression as he realizes that Emma has survived, but also that her life has been forever changed by her connection to their family. The old soldier reaches for her hand with shaking fingers, his voice cracked with emotion as he thanks her for a sacrifice she never should have been asked to make, for choosing them over the safety of ignorance and ordinary human existence. Emma feels the bond settling into her consciousness like a new sense, allowing her to perceive Adrian's emotions as clearly as her own heartbeat, to understand his relief at her survival and his determination to protect her from the consequences of their connection. She realizes that her simple desire to bring soup to a lonely veteran has pulled her into a world where every kindness carries political implications, where her continued existence depends on navigating supernatural politics she barely understands. The following weeks pass in a blur of adjustment as Emma learns to function with abilities that transform her understanding of reality itself. She can sense vampire emotions through walls, see through glamour that would fool normal human perception, feel the supernatural threats that constantly circle Adrian's territory, like sharks sensing blood in the water. Her apartment becomes a fortress, warded with protections older than written history. Every window and door inscribed with symbols that would drive normal humans insane if they truly comprehended their meaning. She continues working at the hospital, but now under the protection of Adrian's network, supernatural allies who watch her from shadows and ensure that her new knowledge remains secret from those who would exploit or eliminate her. Thomas becomes her guide to vampire culture, teaching her the subtle protocols that govern interactions between species, explaining hierarchies and traditions that span millennia and determine who lives and dies based on ancient precedents. She learns that Adrian rules the northeastern United States not through violence, but through carefully negotiated treaties with werewolf packs, witch covens, and other supernatural entities who maintain their own territories within his domain. His reputation for fairness and protection of mortals has made him powerful enemies among traditionalist vampires who view humans as nothing more than sophisticated cattle, creatures to be used and discarded rather than protected and respected. Emma's presence in his life serves as proof to these enemies that he has been corrupted by human sentiment, that his attachment to mortal concerns makes him weak and unfit to hold territory in vampire society. She discovers that every Thursday visit, every shared meal and conversation with Thomas has been monitored and reported to courts across Europe and Asia, analyzed for signs of weakness that could be exploited by rivals seeking to expand their own power. When she returns to her nursing duties, Emma's enhanced perception reveals a hidden world that has always existed parallel to human society, but invisible to normal awareness. She notices patients whose injuries heal impossibly fast or fail to respond to treatment in ways that suggest supernatural involvement, staff members who move with predatory grace and avoid mirrors, mysterious accidents that befall people who ask too many questions about unusual cases. The emergency room becomes a battlefield where she witnesses the consequences of supernatural conflicts, humans caught in crossfire between entities they cannot understand, treated for wounds that medical science cannot explain. She begins to recognize the signs of vampire feeding, werewolf attacks, and curses that manifest as seemingly natural diseases. Her nursing experience allowing her to identify patterns that would escape notice from less observant medical professionals. Her enhanced senses reveal the network of supernatural influence that permeates human institutions, shapeshifters working as security guards, vampires serving as night shift supervisors, witches employed as counselors and social workers. She realizes that the boundary between human and supernatural society is far more porous than either side pretends, that cooperation and conflict happen constantly in ways that most people never suspect. The knowledge weighs on her consciousness like a burden she cannot share, making every interaction with normal humans feel like performance art, maintaining the illusion of ignorance while her awareness encompasses threats and wonders beyond their imagination. Emma learns to navigate the delicate balance between her human identity and her new role as bloodkeeper, understanding that her survival depends on serving both communities while betraying neither. She discovers that her bond with Adrian grants her protection, but also makes her a target for his enemies, that every day brings new threats from vampires who view her existence as proof of his weakness and corruption. The hospital becomes a hunting ground where she must identify and report supernatural activity while maintaining her cover as an ordinary nurse, walking the razor edge between useful intelligence gathering and dangerous exposure. Her relationship with Thomas deepens as she learns the full extent of his knowledge about supernatural society. Decades of accumulated wisdom from his service in Project Nightfall and his years as Adrian's father. She begins to understand the complex web of loyalties and betrayals that define vampire politics, the way ancient grudges and modern pragmatism create alliances that shift like shadows at midnight. Emma realizes that her simple act of bringing soup to a lonely veteran has made her a player in games that span centuries, where a single mistake could trigger conflicts that would devastate both human and supernatural populations. Her awareness of the constant threats surrounding their small family unit grows daily, from shapeshifters who probe their defenses to ancient vampires who send subtle challenges designed to test Adrian's resolve to protect her. She learns to read the signs of impending violence in supernatural body language, to recognize the difference between territorial displays and genuine threats, to understand the complex rituals that govern vampire society, and determine when conflict becomes inevitable. The weight of knowledge settles on her shoulders like armor made of shadows, protecting her through awareness while burdening her with responsibilities she never chose but cannot abandon without betraying those who have become her family in ways that transcend blood and species. Emma's enhanced perception picks up subtle wrongness in the emergency room that her colleagues miss entirely, patients arriving with wounds that close themselves between examination and treatment, blood samples that change composition while sitting in laboratory tubes, security footage that shows empty corridors when witnesses swear they saw someone enter. She begins documenting these anomalies in coded notes, patterns that speak of supernatural violence bleeding into the mortal world in ways that threaten the careful balance Adrian has maintained for decades. The first case arrives on a Tuesday night, a construction worker with puncture wounds on his throat that heal visibly while she takes his vitals, his blood work showing cellular regeneration rates that would be impossible for normal humans, but consistent with someone who survived a vampire feeding attempt. 3 more similar cases follow over the next week, each victim bearing wounds that suggest different supernatural attackers, each displaying physiological changes that indicate exposure to otherworldly influences. Emma's bond with Adrian allows her to sense his growing alarm as she reports these incidents, feeling his ancient mind analyzing patterns and reaching conclusions that fill him with dread and rage. The attacks escalate quickly, moving from failed feedings to successful kills, bodies appearing in locked rooms with wounds that forensic science cannot explain, victims who vanish from hospital beds leaving only bloodstains and the lingering scent of predators that have no place in the mortal world. Through her connection to Adrian, Emma feels him reaching out to his network of allies and informants, probing the supernatural underground for information about who would dare hunt in his territory without permission or challenge his authority so directly. The answer comes through channels that predate electronic communication, whispered reports from creatures old enough to remember when the world was younger and vampire politics were settled with open warfare rather than careful diplomacy. Dmitry Volkov has returned from exile, backed by European courts who view Adrian's protection of humans as dangerous precedent that threatens the natural order of predator and prey. Emma learns through Adrian's memories that Dmitri served as his lieutenant during the Renaissance, a brilliant tactician whose strategic mind was matched only by his cruelty toward mortals, particularly children whose innocence he found both irresistible and repulsive. The exile came after Dmitri established feeding grounds in orphanages across 3 countries, creating a supply of victims that would have exposed vampire society to human authorities if Adrian had not intervened with extreme prejudice. Centuries of hatred have festered during Dimitri's banishment, transforming tactical disagreement into personal vendetta, driving him to seek not just revenge, but proof that Adrian's compassionate policies make him unfit to rule vampire territory. The pattern of attacks becomes clear as Adrian shares his analysis through their blood bond, showing Emma how each incident targets humans connected to supernatural entities, allies who serve as bridges between worlds, food sources who provide willing sustenance, blood keepers who care for vampire families. Dimitri's strategy aims to demonstrate that human connections make vampires weak and vulnerable. That attachment to mortal concerns creates exploitable weaknesses that traditional vampires would never tolerate. Emma feels Adrian's fear not for himself, but for her and Thomas, understanding that they represent the most visible symbols of his supposed corruption, proof that he values human lives beyond their utility as food or servants. The apartment building becomes the obvious target as word spreads through supernatural channels that Adrian the Merciful keeps his disabled father in a mortal care facility, tended by a human bloodkeeper, whose weekly visits have become legendary among vampires who whisper about their king's strange attachment to compassion. Thomas wheels his chair to the window each evening, his military instincts alerting him to watchers in shadows and movement patterns that suggest reconnaissance rather than casual observation. Emma's enhanced senses pick up the predators circling their sanctuary, creatures that move with inhuman grace and patience, testing defenses and probing for weaknesses in ways that make her skin crawl with primitive terror. The first direct assault comes at midnight on a Thursday, exactly 1 week after Emma's latest soup delivery, timing chosen to emphasize the symbolic importance of her weekly visits to their enemies' propaganda. Emma's bond with Adrian explodes with warning sensations as supernatural killers breach the building's outer defenses, moving through corridors with the confidence of predators who have studied their prey for weeks. She alerts Adrian through their connection while simultaneously calling Thomas to warn him of the immediate danger, feeling her heart race as she realizes that her presence in their lives has finally drawn lethal attention from enemies older than nations. Adrian's response transforms the apartment building into something that defies architectural logic. Walls shifting to create corridors that lead nowhere, stairs that climb infinitely upward without reaching higher floors, windows that open onto voids filled with starlight from alien constellations. The protective wards he activates drain decades from his apparent age, revealing the true cost of maintaining such powerful defenses in a world where magic must be hidden from mortal observation. Emma watches through their bond as he positions supernatural guards in every shadow, creatures bound to his service by oaths older than written history, each one a predator capable of destroying normal humans but loyal to Adrian through bonds forged in blood and mutual benefit. The apartment becomes an island of safety surrounded by hostile forces, but Emma realizes that the siege itself serves Dimitri's purposes by forcing Adrian to reveal the full extent of his power and resources to every supernatural entity monitoring the situation. The cost of protection becomes visible as Adrian's usually perfect features show signs of strain and age, centuries of accumulated weariness, breaking through the glamour that normally conceals the weight of immortal existence. Emma feels his exhaustion through their bond, understanding that maintaining such extensive defenses requires constant attention and energy that leaves him vulnerable to other threats throughout his territory. Thomas becomes their strategic advisor, despite his physical limitations. his military experience invaluable for analyzing enemy tactics and predicting their next moves based on reconnaissance patterns and assault timing. He reveals that his wheelchair-accessible apartment was chosen not just for convenience, but for its defensive advantages, multiple exit routes and sight lines that reflect decades of thinking like a soldier rather than a civilian. The old veteran wheels himself to his bedroom closet and retrieves journals he has been keeping since Vietnam. Detailed records of supernatural activity and government cooperation that span 5 decades of careful observation and documentation. Emma reads through entries that chronicle the hidden history of human supernatural relations, detailed accounts of treaties and betrayals, names and locations of entities that most humans believe are myths, evidence of cooperation and conflict that could reshape both societies if revealed to the wrong people. Thomas explains that Dimitri's true goal extends beyond simple revenge, that the ancient vampire seeks to obtain these journals as proof that vampires have been manipulating human governments for decades, evidence that could be used to justify a supernatural war against humanity. The journals contain information about Project Nightfall and similar programs, classified operations where humans and supernatural entities work together against threats that neither species could handle alone, cooperation that saved countless lives but violated the traditional separation between worlds. Emma realizes that her weekly soup visits have inadvertently placed Thomas's accumulated knowledge at risk, that her genuine care for an old soldier has created vulnerabilities that enemies are now exploiting with surgical precision. Through her bond with Adrian, she feels his rage at being forced into a defensive position, his frustration at having to choose between protecting his family and maintaining the broader stability of his territory. The siege continues through the night as Dimitri's forces probe for weaknesses, while Adrian's defenders hold the line, supernatural predators clashing in battles that would drive normal humans insane if they truly comprehended the violence occurring just outside their awareness. Emma monitors the conflict through her enhanced senses, feeling each casualty and victory as if they were her own, understanding that the outcome will determine not just their survival, but the future of human-vampire relations across multiple continents. She watches Thomas review tactical maps and defensive positions with the expertise of someone who survived real warfare, his mind still sharp despite his physical limitations, his strategic insights proving invaluable for coordinating their defense against enemies who think like generals rather than simple predators. The weight of responsibility settles on her shoulders as she realizes that her choice to bring soup to a lonely veteran has triggered a conflict that could reshape the supernatural world, that her simple human kindness has become a symbol that both sides will fight to control or destroy. Dimitri's ultimatum arrives through channels that demonstrate both his cunning and his contempt for human life, delivered by Sarah Chen, Emma's closest friend among the hospital nursing staff, whose vacant eyes and wooden delivery reveal that she has been enthralled and turned into a living message system. The ancient vampire's words flow from Sarah's lips with mechanical precision, each syllable carrying the weight of absolute authority and barely contained violence, demanding that Thomas surrender his journals within 72 hours or watch as every human in the city becomes collateral damage in a supernatural war that will paint the streets red with innocent blood. Emma feels the horror of seeing her friend reduced to a puppet, her genuine concern for Sarah's well-being warring with the terrible knowledge that any attempt to break the enthrallment would likely kill the woman she has worked alongside for 3 years. Through her bond with Adrian, she senses his rage at this violation of the unspoken rules that govern supernatural conflict, the use of innocent humans as weapons, representing a line that even his enemies rarely cross without enormous provocation. The ultimatum forces them to confront the reality that their defenses, however impressive, cannot protect an entire city from the kind of widespread supernatural violence that Dimitri threatens to unleash unless his demands are met completely and unconditionally. Thomas receives the message with the grim composure of a soldier who has faced impossible choices before, his weathered hands steady as he considers options that range from surrendering his life's work to watching thousands of innocents die for the crime of living in the wrong city at the wrong time. Emma volunteers immediately to offer herself as hostage in exchange for civilian safety, reasoning that her value as Adrian's bloodkeeper might satisfy Dimitri's need for symbolic victory while protecting the population from wholesale slaughter. Adrian's rejection of this plan carries the force of absolute refusal, his ancient voice cracking with emotion as he explains that surrendering Emma would not appease Dimitri, but merely provide him with additional leverage to extract even greater concessions. The old vampire's strategy becomes clear as they analyze the ultimatum's structure and timing, designed not just to obtain Thomas's journals, but to force Adrian into impossible choices that will either destroy his reputation for protecting humans or demonstrate his weakness by sacrificing those closest to him. Thomas surprises them both by supporting a modified version of Emma's sacrifice, proposing to use his military contacts to arrange a meeting with government officials who have always known about supernatural entities but maintained plausible deniability for decades. The plan requires formalizing the shadow treaties that have governed human supernatural relations since World War II, transforming unspoken agreements into legal frameworks that would make Dimitri's threats constitute treason against both species. Emma realizes that her role as bloodkeeper uniquely qualifies her to serve as translator between worlds, using her bond with Adrian to facilitate communication between entities that have spent centuries avoiding direct contact. The government meeting takes place in a bunker deep beneath Washington, D.C., a facility that exists in official records as a civil defense installation, but actually serves as a conference center for discussions that cannot happen in normal reality. Emma finds herself sitting between a vampire king and a committee of generals and intelligence officials, each side viewing the other with suspicion tempered by grudging respect for their mutual ability to destroy civilization if cooperation fails. Her bond with Adrian allows her to translate not just words, but intentions and emotional undertones, bridging the gap between human pragmatism and vampire honor in ways that pure diplomacy could never achieve. The negotiations proceed with agonizing slowness as both sides probe for advantage, while the clock ticks toward Dimitri's deadline, each concession carefully weighed against the consequences of exposure or betrayal. Thomas's journals provide crucial evidence of successful cooperation between species, documented cases where human supernatural alliances saved lives and prevented catastrophes that neither side could have handled alone. The formal treaty emerges from hours of debate as a framework that acknowledges supernatural existence while maintaining the secrecy necessary to prevent mass panic, establishing protocols for cooperation and conflict resolution that transform shadow agreements into binding law. But even as the treaty is signed with blood and witnessed by entities older than nations, Dimitri's forces prepare their final assault on the sanctuary, where Emma first learned the truth about the world beyond human perception. The hospital becomes the chosen battlefield because its maze of corridors and abundant blood supply create tactical advantages for vampires, while placing hundreds of innocent patients and staff at risk. Emma arrives for her regular shift to find the building subtly transformed, shadows deeper than they should be, temperatures fluctuating in ways that suggest supernatural influence, familiar colleagues moving with predatory grace that marks them as either thralled or replaced entirely. Her enhanced senses pick up the supernatural tension crackling through the air like electricity before a thunderstorm, the way predators position themselves in anticipation of violence that will reshape the local balance of power, regardless of its outcome. Adrian materializes in the hospital's basement morgue, choosing a location surrounded by death to draw upon the dark energies that fuel vampire magic, his presence immediately detected by Dimitri's watchers, but serving as deliberate provocation to draw the enemy into direct confrontation. The battle that follows transcends simple violence to become a philosophical argument conducted with fangs and claws, each exchange of blows representing competing visions of what vampire society should become in the modern world. Emma uses her medical knowledge to guide terrified civilians to safety, her bond with Adrian allowing her to anticipate the flow of supernatural combat and position herself where she can do the most good for innocent victims. Thomas wheels himself through hospital corridors that have become a war zone, activating supernatural artifacts he collected during decades of military service, items that level the playing field between ancient vampires by channeling powers that predate their transformation. The artifacts include a Roman legion standard blessed by priests who knew the true nature of the undead, a Viking shield inscribed with runes that turn vampire strength against itself, and a samurai sword that cuts through supernatural illusion as easily as flesh and bone. Emma's bond with Adrian proves crucial as the battle reaches its climax, allowing her to channel enough of his power to see through Dimitri's mental attacks and counter illusions that would drive normal humans insane with terror. She becomes more than observer or victim, serving as Adrian's anchor to his compassionate nature, while providing tactical intelligence that only someone with medical training could recognize. The turning point comes when one of Dimitri's followers, a vampire barely a century old, who still remembers being human, suffers critical injuries from Thomas's artifacts and lies bleeding on the hospital floor. Emma's instinctive response overrides political considerations as she drops to her knees beside the wounded enemy, her nursing training taking over as she works to save a life regardless of whose side the victim represents. Her actions create a moment of stunned silence in the midst of supernatural warfare. Vampires on both sides watching as the human they have been fighting over demonstrates the very compassion that Dimitri claims makes Adrian weak. The wounded vampire looks up at Emma with eyes that reflect centuries of accumulated cynicism, his voice cracked with disbelief as he asks why she would help someone who came to kill her and everyone she cares about. Emma's answer carries the weight of absolute truth as she explains that healing is what she does, that her oath to preserve life transcends species and politics, that the compassion Dimitri views as weakness is actually the strength that makes cooperation between vampires and humans not just possible, but necessary. The effect on Dimitri's followers proves more devastating than any physical weapon, forcing them to confront the possibility that human emotions might enhance rather than diminish vampire capabilities, that Adrian's policies represent evolution rather than corruption. Dimitri himself falters as he watches his carefully chosen allies begin to question the fundamental assumptions underlying their assault, his certainty shaken by witnessing genuine selfless behavior from the human he expected to be weak and easily manipulated. The ancient vampire's defeat comes not through superior force, but through the collapse of his ideological foundation, the realization that his followers no longer believe that human connections necessarily make vampires vulnerable to their enemies. Emma tends to the wounded with the same professional competence she brings to her regular patients, her actions serving as living proof that the cooperation formalized in the treaty represents practical necessity rather than sentimental weakness. The aftermath of Dimitri's defeat leaves the hospital looking like a disaster zone, broken windows and damaged corridors, telling a story that official reports will blame on a gas explosion, while supernatural authorities work to restore the carefully maintained illusion of normal reality. Emma finds herself at the center of unprecedented negotiations as government officials, vampire representatives, and other supernatural entities converge to formalize agreements that have existed in shadow for decades. Her unique position as Bloodkeeper and her demonstrated ability to bridge both worlds, making her the obvious choice to facilitate communication between species that have spent centuries avoiding direct contact. Thomas's journals provide the historical foundation for the treaty discussions, decades of meticulous documentation proving that cooperation between humans and supernatural entities has saved countless lives while preventing catastrophes that neither side could have handled alone. The formal negotiations take place in secure facilities that exist outside normal reality, conference rooms warded against both electronic surveillance and supernatural eavesdropping, where lawyers trained in international law work alongside beings old enough to remember when such laws were first written in blood and moonlight. Emma serves as cultural translator, using her bond with Adrian to convey not just words, but intentions and emotional undertones that pure diplomacy could never capture, helping both sides understand that their mutual survival depends on moving beyond the traditional predator-prey dynamic to embrace something resembling actual partnership. The treaty that emerges from months of careful negotiation establishes a new framework for supernatural human relations, acknowledging the existence of vampires, werewolves, and other entities while maintaining the secrecy necessary to prevent mass panic and social collapse. The document creates a new classification of humans called witnesses, individuals granted legal permission to know about supernatural society in exchange for serving as cultural ambassadors and crisis mediators between worlds. Emma becomes the first official witness, her position protected by both human and vampire law, her role encompassing everything from emergency medical care for supernatural entities to diplomatic liaison work that prevents minor misunderstandings from escalating into species-wide conflicts. Adrian's northeastern territory serves as the pilot region for implementing the new protocols, his reputation for fairness and protection of mortals, making his domain the ideal testing ground for cooperation that could either revolutionize both societies or trigger the very wars the treaty seeks to prevent. The arrangement faces resistance from traditionalists on both sides, humans who view supernatural entities as demonic threats, and vampires who consider mortals nothing more than sophisticated cattle. But Emma's demonstrated competence and the practical benefits of cooperation gradually win over skeptics, who recognize that the alternative is mutual destruction. Her work at the hospital expands to include treating supernatural patients whose injuries cannot be explained by conventional medicine, training selected medical professionals in cross-species physiology, and establishing protocols for handling cases where vampire feeding, werewolf attacks, or magical accidents result in human casualties that require both medical intervention and supernatural damage control. The witness program grows slowly but steadily as carefully selected individuals prove capable of maintaining secrecy while serving as bridges between communities that have spent millennia viewing each other with suspicion and fear. Emma discovers that her nursing background provides ideal preparation for the complex challenges of supernatural diplomacy, her experience with traumatized patients translating directly to mediating disputes between beings whose emotional wounds often span centuries rather than years. The training programs she develops teach medical professionals to recognize signs of supernatural involvement in emergency cases while maintaining the discretion necessary to protect both patients and society from the chaos that would follow widespread exposure. Adrian adapts to sharing his authority with human officials, finding that transparency actually strengthens his position by reducing the enormous energy expenditure required to maintain elaborate deceptions and allowing him to focus on genuine threats rather than bureaucratic manipulation. His relationship with Emma evolves beyond the traditional bloodkeeper bond into something unprecedented in vampire society, a partnership based on mutual respect and shared goals, rather than the usual dynamics of dominance and submission. The other supernatural entities in his territory initially view the new arrangements with suspicion, werewolf pack leaders questioning whether cooperation with humans will weaken their natural advantages, while witch covens worry that exposure will lead to renewed persecution, reminiscent of historical witch hunts. Emma's careful diplomacy and demonstrated competence gradually win their acceptance as she proves capable of protecting their interests while facilitating beneficial exchanges with human authorities who can provide resources and legal protection unavailable through supernatural channels alone. The treaty includes provisions for joint task forces to address threats that endanger both species, establishing protocols for sharing intelligence about rogue supernatural entities, human terrorist groups targeting non-human populations, and interdimensional incursions that require coordinated responses. Thomas becomes an unexpected celebrity in supernatural circles, his military experience and extensive documentation making him a valuable advisor for entities who have never needed to consider how their actions might affect large-scale human society. His journals are published as classified educational materials distributed to both human officials and supernatural leaders, learning to navigate the complex challenges of formal cooperation rather than the informal arrangements that have governed their interactions for centuries. The old veteran's apartment continues to serve as an informal meeting place where representatives from different communities can interact in neutral territory, his presence providing a stabilizing influence that helps prevent minor disagreements from escalating into major conflicts. Emma's Thursday soup visits expand into planning sessions for implementing witness programs in other regions, her successful work in Adrian's territory, providing a template that can be adapted to different cultural contexts and supernatural populations around the world. She travels to conferences where vampire lords from European courts meet with government officials from multiple nations. Her unique perspective as someone who bridges both worlds, making her insights invaluable for preventing the misunderstandings that have historically led to bloodshed on both sides. The work proves exhausting but deeply fulfilling as she watches suspicious enemies gradually develop working relationships based on mutual benefit rather than mutual destruction, small victories that accumulate into systemic changes affecting both species' approaches to coexistence. Her relationship with Adrian deepens beyond the supernatural bond that initially connected them, evolving into genuine partnership where his ancient wisdom complements her modern medical knowledge and diplomatic skills to create something neither could achieve alone. 6 months after the formal treaty signing, Emma continues bringing soup to Thomas every Thursday. But their quiet afternoons now include reviewing reports from witness programs in other cities, analyzing data on successful interventions, and planning expansions that could eventually encompass global supernatural human cooperation. The kitchen table where she first learned the truth about vampire society has become a command center for coordination efforts that span multiple continents, maps and documents spreading across its scarred surface, while Adrian reviews diplomatic correspondence from courts and governments worldwide. Thomas has aged visibly during the intense negotiations and implementation phases, but his eyes remain sharp with the satisfaction of someone who has lived to see his life's work validated and expanded beyond his wildest expectations. His stories about Vietnam and Project Nightfall have become required reading for both human officials and supernatural entities, learning to understand how cooperation can benefit both sides when properly managed and protected from those who would exploit it for personal gain. Emma reflects on how her simple desire to bring soup to a lonely veteran has transformed not just her own existence, but the fundamental relationship between species that have spent millennia as predators and prey, allies and enemies, occupying the same world while remaining invisible to each other. The hospital where she works has become a model for integrated medical care, treating both human and supernatural patients while training the next generation of medical professionals in cross-species healthcare that acknowledges the reality of non-human physiology without compromising the secrecy necessary for social stability. Her enhanced senses allow her to monitor the supernatural landscape for early warning signs of conflict, while her medical training provides practical skills for treating injuries that result from the cultural misunderstandings that still occur despite the best diplomatic efforts. The city outside their window continues its daily rhythm of traffic and commerce, unaware that its safety now depends on the fragile trust built around a kitchen table between a nurse who chose compassion over fear, a vampire king who chose cooperation over domination, and a disabled veteran whose wisdom helped bridge the gap between worlds that had remained separate for far too long. Thomas raises his spoon in a mock toast, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who has found meaning in unexpected places and purpose in the most ordinary moments, declaring his gratitude for Thursday soup and all the impossible things that grow from ordinary kindness when nurtured by people who believe that understanding is always preferable to conflict, regardless of the species involved or the cost of building bridges that most consider unbuildable.